mendelspod.com, advancing life science research, connecting people and ideas.
Welcome to Mendel's Pod. Our guest is Richard Price, the founder and CEO of Academia.edu. It's an online platform for academics to share their papers. The site's growing quickly. Richard and his team just raised $4.5 million, and we're really excited to have him on the program.
Today's show is made possible by SA Depot, the world's largest cloud-based marketplace for research services. With SA Depot, you can easily find the perfect research service provider and manage your project from anywhere in the world.
Thanks for having us to your office.
Thanks for coming. Good to be with you.
So is there any money in this open science stuff?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a huge industry, actually. I mean, I think as research comes, I mean, it's a big topic, and I could talk about it for a while, but fundamentally, I think as research comes online, which I think is a trend we're seeing right now, as scientific research becomes like, natively web content, I think it's going to be tracked and mineable in a way that will deliver enormous economic benefits to the people who rely on research, which is basically the R&D companies. So in other words, I think the R&D companies, Pfizer and Novartis, who spend billions and tens of billions every year on R&D, I mean, Pfizer alone has like a $7 or $8 billion annual R&D budget, if you can build tools that help them deploy the $8 billion annual R&D budget better, i.e. find promising research more efficiently, then I think there's going to be, and I think that will happen as research becomes trackable and mineable. I think they'll pay a lot for those tools.
So you're a doctor of philosophy from Oxford.
Right, yeah.
So shouldn't you be standing in the street asking for alms and...
Well, it's a good question.
Did you sell your soul to Silicon Valley?
It's a good question. I mean, sometimes people do ask me, like, what is the connection between entrepreneurship and philosophy? Because they don't seem now related. And I actually think there are some interesting connections. I mean, I think fundamentally philosophy is about, as we sort of go about in our daily lives, we sort of speed along through these logical transitions. And we don't really sort of stop to sort of magnify them and to see whether they're correct or incorrect. And the role of philosophy is to sort of look at a logical transition and slow our minds down and sort of examine really, is that logical transition like correct or not? Mm-hmm. And especially as you experience a sort of glitch, as you sort of go through a logical transition, whether you're thinking about some topic like knowledge or free will or moral qualities or something like that, the idea of a philosopher is to, let's slow down that glitch, let's magnify it, let's see if it really reflects some real problem in the underlying transition, and maybe there's a real issue there. And similarly in everyday life, as far as practical things are concerned, what happens is that we modulate in our behavior. So it's just a very skillfully navigate around these obstacles that actually really do exist, and these problems that really do exist in daily life. And I think the role of an entrepreneur is to sort of slow our practical activity down and sort of check for these obstacles and sort of see if we're actually changing our behavior. And if we are, then we say, that's a real problem there to be solved.
There's an opportunity.
So I think that, there's an opportunity. I think that the similarity between philosophy and entrepreneurship is about finding problems. Mm-hmm. Like finding important problems. Like in philosophy, it's about slowing down logical transition of thought and sort of hunting for problems there. And in entrepreneurship, it's about like slowing down, like seeing how we're unconsciously modulating our everyday behavior to get around obstacles that we don't even know about, not even consciously reflecting on. And that's where the opportunities are. So I think it's all about like having a fine eye for, in one case, logical problems in thought, in the other case, practical problems in everyday life. And I think that's the connect. I mean, there are a lot of differences, but I think that when it comes to like problem finding, I think it's a really important skill, and I think there are some similarities there.
So what problem did you find?
So
what glitch did you get caught in?
So when I was doing my PhD in Oxford, I was actually I started a few different companies along the side. I had a banana cake company selling banana cakes in London, and that morphed into a sandwich company because sandwich is more lucrative. So that was called Dashing Lunches, and then...
And what problem was that going after?
Well, it was, in that case, trying to remember the actual eureka moment where I came up with the banana cake. So I was just sort of looking, I think in that case I I had a great banana cake recipe and wanted to
Okay,
wanted
I'm
to
just
sell it.
teasing you. Please go on to your.
And then after the sandwich company, created this sort of Craigslist for Oxford style company. It was just about like student accommodation. And I mean, I guess, yeah, there was a sort of, inspiration moment there in the sense of like, it turns out it was extremely difficult to search for a student accommodation online. So I created a site where you could do that. These are all just side projects, basically. I had a number of side projects. And then when I finished the PhD, I was like, okay, I had this idea for Academia.edu, and the problem I was experiencing is personally, and I actually very clearly remember the phone call I was having with a friend where the sort of penny dropped, that I was trying to like share my papers from my PhD online. And it was really difficult. There wasn't just a really easy sort of platform where you could go and do that. You had to sort of create your own custom HTML page, and it would be a siloed page that probably no one would necessarily know about, because why would they know about it? And so I kind of thought, well, lots of other people are probably having this problem. And so I decided to go and build that company. I could see that like Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn were taking off. I could see that the scientific world needed a kind of connected platform. So I decided to be the person to build that.
So the first thing I noticed was the name. You got the .edu.
Yeah.
And how did you get that? Because usually that's like academic institutions.
Yeah, that's right. So before 2001, anyone could register a .edu, and they weren't subject to the restrictions that you had to be a sort of 4-year kind of university. And those names are grandfathered in, and one of our subsidiary companies actually registered it prior to 2001. So that's why we wanted Academia.edu.
So you've had the name for a while.
One of our subsidiaries, yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay. So what's cool about Academia.edu?
Well, I mean, our mission is to accelerate the world's research, and our thesis is that historically scientific content is being sort of created natively as desktop content, like PDFs and uploaded to the web. And I think increasingly what's happening, it's being created as sort of native web content. And I think that as that trend continues, it's going to increasingly inherit all the characteristics of native web content. I think the two most important characteristics of native web content as far as science is concerned are, one, instant distribution. And this is a really, really big deal that in large-scale web, like we take it for granted that if you share a tweet, it gets published instantly. If you post a photo on Facebook, it gets published instantly.
Yeah.
Same with blog posts. In the science world, if you send a paper off to a journal, it doesn't typically get published for another 12 months. There's a 12-month time lag. That's a huge time lag. If you see a paper and want to respond to it, you say that's wrong, and you want to respond to it, it's going to take 12 months for that response to come out. So if you imagine the compounded effects of over a 12-month time lag on every single iteration of the conversation, because science is fundamentally a conversation around the world, that's a huge slowdown, that's a huge break, as it were. I sort of feel like it's a huge break on scientific progress. So I think the one thing that you're going to be seeing, and we're certainly helping to make happen, is instant distribution. The second thing I believe strongly in is something called rich media, which I think, I reflect on the fact that historically there's been a single mode of publication in science, which is the paper. And all ideas have to be published in the form of a paper. And I think that, honestly, a lot of scientific content, i.e. stuff that gets generated in the form during the scientific process, it doesn't lend itself to being in a scientific paper like data. The data that gets generated from experiments.
Because of the massive amount of storage.
Yeah, I mean, people put a tiny subset of those data sets in the paper as a sort of table. An unstructured, sort of unmachine readable table. And in this day and age, what a reader really wants is the actual data set themselves. They want the code that runs on the data set. They want to see stuff in video format, which is what, this is why we're doing this, because sometimes video format is a great way of sharing ideas and getting an idea across. I think that comments are a big deal. Like, I think if you have comments on all this media, if you see a paper or a blog post or something and you want to respond to it, I think that a small comment, for instance, you just want to be able to add that in straight away. Comments haven't really taken off for various reasons. There's some interesting reasons why rich media as a whole hasn't taken off. I think those reasons are
By rich media, do you mean like Web 2.0? Or?
I mean things like videos.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I mean things like sharing the data set, sharing the code, and having comments on papers, having blog posts, status updates. I think just a much wider variety of the ways in which scientists can share their ideas. So those are the two main things that academia is working on: instant distribution and allowing rich media in science. The first thing is what we're focusing on so far, but we're increasingly working on various rich media things.
So there's some other platforms out there. We recently had Mendeley on.
Yeah.
How would you compare or contrast yourself with that, ResearchGate, even Google Scholar?
Yeah, great questions. And I think Mendeley is like primarily a desktop application. It's a sort of reference manager.
Right, you can
desktop.
download that and manage your papers.
You know, it's less focused on like the sharing component. We're very focused on sharing. We're very focused on this is a great place if you want to share your papers and get the widest possible audience. Another component of academia is we also focus a lot on analytics. So we have an analytics application, so you can see like page views of your papers, what countries those page views are coming from, what search engines are driving the most traffic. So you can see a kind of Google Analytics style interface but very focused on your research content and your research impact. So that's the kind of the core difference between academia and Mendeley. With ResearchGate is a pure online platform like academia. But it's less focused on like sharing papers and analytics around that. It's more focused on discussion rooms. So it has these discussion rooms and it tries to sort of get high quality discussion among scientists and less focused on the sort of papers and analytics in the newsfeed.
And then Google Scholar, you don't
So
have
Google Scholar, I mean, that's a search engine for papers.
It's just a search engine. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't really have any social component about kind of sharing. They've recently released a product called Google Scholar Citations where you can sort of like log in and see how many citations your papers have got, but it's not a sort of social product where you can follow people or sort of like share content or yeah, it's primarily a search engine.
So let's talk about those metrics. I mean, citation and this is where you're going, right? Is information that you can get about paper that you couldn't get in the traditional publishing mode. And so what can you do that traditional publishing cannot do?
Well, I mean, I think that as scientific content becomes natively web content, I think that how you measure the impact of a piece of scientific content will increasingly sort of reflect how generally a piece of content gets traction on the web. You'll look at things like, you know, page views and downloads. I think you'll look at things like general sort of online usage. And I think that, you know, historically, there were basically sort of one primary way of evaluating the impact of a particular paper. Like this is the last sort of few hundred years, which is what's the quality of journal that you managed to get this paper published in. That's sort of the primary measure. If you look at someone's resume, you'd be scanning a list of journal titles. And that would be the person's like best representation of that scientific impact. I mean, there are obviously things like prizes, like the Nobel Prize, but by and large, it's like where you've got published.
I've been published here and here.
Right. The last sort of 10 years, in fact, I think this trend has been largely driven by Google Scholar, actually, because they made citation counts like publicly verifiable and sort of transparent and accessible. What you're seeing is increasingly scientists finding their own citation counts and how many inbound citations there are to their papers, and they're viewing their citations as a sort of measure of their impact. And I think that another trend we're seeing on academia is that people are getting proud about the fact that they've got a lot of page views around their papers, or that they're getting significant international reach, and especially when they're up for, say, tenure, you have to build up a dossier of like your impact and your work as an academic, and it's very, given the sort of intense competition for resources in science, both for grants and for jobs, ultimately, you want as much material as possible to demonstrate the impact of your work. And page views and generally sort of like how many followers you have is just another kind of metric.
Yeah, I read somewhere where someone had actually included that in their resume or something. These kind of metrics.
We see our users do that quite a lot.
Yeah.
And they quite frequently write in saying, and we actually build tools for them specifically to make it easier for them to export their stats and include them with their tenure application.
Okay, so let's talk about that sort of debate, really. You recently wrote a piece at TechCrunch talking about crowd review and social review.
That's right, yeah.
And this is what we're talking about, right? I mean, page hits.
Yeah, I mean, so I actually think of peer review as splitting into two halves. One half is about discovery.
Yeah.
How do you, as an academic, how do you discover your research? And the second half is how do you establish the impact of your work? How do you how do you demonstrate that your work has been discovered a lot, I guess? And I think that they're related concepts, but they're two different functions of peer review. And the crowd review and the social review stuff I talked about in that article was all about discovery. It was all about how does an academic discover content right now? How do you expect an academic to be discovering content in the future, academic content?
Okay, so it helps discovery.
Yeah.
But I guess the other component you mentioned is maintaining the quality,
Metrics.
right? Metrics of the quality of the research.
Yeah. I mean, I think right now, okay, so there was a time, when when an academic, in terms of like the papers that they would read per week, probably 90% of those they would actually discover by walking down to the library, thumbing through the latest journal, and just deciding what to read on that basis. So in other words, in that case, the sort of journal peer review process was driving enormous, part of enormous percentage of the discovery of science. I think honestly, if you talk to scientists right now, like how they discover of the 10 papers they read per week, where do they come from? How do they discover them? Honestly, like most of it is from like search engines, like just finding, it's going for a dedicated search on Google Scholar or Google itself or PubMed, which is a big search engine, or recommendations from their colleagues. I think that there's been lots of great stuff and great work in the search engine side of things for academic content. There's more work to be done there, but I think primarily the stuff we're working on is I think that's where there's a huge opportunity. Is like, what are all? Right now you might get recommendations from your 10 colleagues or something, or just sort of serendipitous recommendations from scientists But what if you could find could follow your 100 favorite scientists around the world, or in my case, the 100 favorite philosophers I know, the philosophers whose judgment I most respect, and I could find out what papers they're reading on a daily basis. That would basically be my reading list.
That's a filter right there.
That's nice a filter, right? That's exactly what Twitter is. That's exactly what Facebook is. It's basically using the people you trust to filter the content out there. And if you have really good frictionless sharing where people can retweet easily or share easily, the result is that things can go viral very, very quickly in that network. So that's kind of that's the filter we're building in academia.
Oh, okay. So can you do that with your profile? Follow. You guys are all academics.
Well, the whole of science, humanities, social sciences, everything.
So you can do that. You can follow whoever is.
You can follow whoever's on the site.
On the site.
And that drives your newsfeed. Basically, your newsfeed is a list of all the articles basically published by the people you're following. And you also, funnily enough, can when you're following topics on the site, that means you see all the content tagged with that topic. So I follow the philosophy of language. So what that means is whenever anyone, even people I'm not following, uploads a paper and tags it with philosophy of language, I see it in my newsfeed. So that does give the content extra distribution.
So do you see a place for traditional publishing and traditional peer review?
I think that peer review is evolving, and I think that the qualitative feedback. So, for instance, fundamentally, the kind of journal peer review system is about two anonymous people spending quite a lot of time reading a paper and writing a report on it, which then gets submitted to the journal, and then they decide whether to publish the paper. I think that in the future, I see definitely a huge role for qualitative feedback. In fact, I see it massively expanded. What I want to see is a world where you post the paper immediately, and it starts getting traction immediately. And that traction is reflected in the page views it gets, the shares it gets, the comments it starts getting. And some of those comments will be really short, some of them will be really long. But I see the comments is like a really, really critical part of, I actually, regard it as a great shame that you publish a paper, and let's suppose that on average maybe 200 people read it in the first year. And let's suppose it gets 1 or 2 citations. And of those 1 or 2 citations, honestly, most citations actually don't come with like a paragraph discussion of the paper. They're just like, I've read this paper and I'm citing it. So the reality is, of those 200 people who read the paper, and all the thoughts that were generated in their minds, the reality is most of those thoughts are just stuck in their heads. They never see the light of day. So if you're interested in that paper, and you're interested in what was the reaction to that paper in the scientific community, right now, you can't see that. They're not like sharing those thoughts. People who read those papers are not sharing those thoughts in the world. They see a world where all of that qualitative feedback gets shared online, or as much of it as possible. And the people who have those ideas, when they're reading it, are incentivized to share those ideas. They're incentivized because they're just part of the conversation, and they get some degree of reputation as a result of that. So to answer your question, I see one way of phrasing my sort of vision for how it's going to change is a massive increase in journal-style peer review. Massive increase in qualitative feedback, but done in real time, and not done in the formal institutionalized way, but done where the academics just find the paper online and there's great commenting stuff. So in other words, you have comments on blogs, you have discussion on Facebook and Twitter. That's all great qualitative feedback. I mean, some people sort of, get quite nervous when they think about scientific discussion online. They sort of think that the trolls might come in and just wreck it all. And they think that,
the trolls?
Well, it's online trolls.
Oh, okay.
They think that, it's not plausible that a serious professor of biology at Harvard is going to come on and be discussing papers online. But I think those fears are overblown. I think you have to get the software environment right. I think you have to get the privacy environment right. But I think fundamentally, they will add their thoughts online. It's just a question of getting the product right.
And then how do you, I guess, you have a way of measuring all the different kind of metrics, like the number of discussions that are being had on this paper.
Right.
I mean, how do you know it's as good a paper as might be published in the New England Journal of Medicine or something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, say paper published in Nature or Science or, any of those top journals, that fundamentally reflects a kind of thumbs up from two pretty well-known scientists.
Yeah.
That's basically a thumbs up based on a fairly sort of in-depth reading of the paper. And, can you model that thumbs up online? Like, can you sort of take out the middleman, the journal, and sort of get the scientist, the prestigious scientist, to directly kind of read the paper and give a thumbs up?
Yeah.
My answer is, yeah, I think you can.
How do you do that? I mean, have you thought of ways to incent them?
So, I think that one of the sort of drawbacks of the current peer review process is a lot of scientists think that it's a real pain to peer review papers. They sort of really their heart sinks when they get a request to peer review a paper, but there's this sort of professional obligation that kicks in that makes them want to do it. And I think part of that is honestly that they don't get any credit for all that work they do. They spend quite a lot of time reading this paper and writing up their thoughts. They might even write up a whole 2 pages, which is actually quite a lot of stuff. And they might have some quite cool ideas. But those ideas never sort of get accredited to them. The best case they might hope for is the author given it's all anonymous, the author in the paper might say, thanks to 2 anonymous referees for making this point. But that's not really it's not how science works. I mean, science is about having identity attached to your ideas. So I think that one of the factors is attaching identity so that you can get credit for your comments on papers. I think another factor, honestly, is just having a really engaged environment where there's actually a real chance that you might get a response to your ideas. Because, I mean, that's some of the sort of excitement and thrill of a conversation, is that you'll get a response. And if you can create an environment which is super engaged, for instance, why do people post on Facebook? Well, it's because there's a reasonably high chance that their friends will look at it, and some chance that their friends might even comment. And I think, why would someone comment? We actually don't honestly have a commenting feature in academia yet. It's something that we're looking to build. Something it's very difficult, which is, so some of the product challenges I was talking about earlier. It's a very challenging thing to get right in terms of privacy and so on. But if you do get it right, and you create an environment where the author can come back and respond quickly, and then you can invite someone else in discussion. By the end of the day, you've had this rich discussion. That's very powerful. You can really move science forward like that.
So what are the privacy challenges there? Because you can have groups, right, or just one-on-one, direct tweets.
That's it. I mean, I think you've put your finger on it, which is that I think that the way people have approached discussion so far when it comes to academic papers online is that they've just had they've put the paper online, they've attached some commenting box at the end of the paper, and they just hope for the best. And the reality is, it's true. Comments works sometimes on blogs. I mean, honestly, not always. Like, some of the comments are pretty low quality, even on top blogs, like the New York Times or TechCrunch or whatever. But I think with a paper, which is such a huge piece of content, and you have like a comment on line 5 of page 3, it's really bizarre as a comment to sort of like a 10,000 word paper to say, I'm commenting on, this micro point on page 3 on line 5. It just feels like a strange experience. So I actually think that, and I think another factor, honestly, is if you look at how academics actually discuss papers offline, they do it in small groups of people. Initially, they'll do it, initially they'll just read the paper themselves in the privacy of their own study, in their own lab. And then they might even, talk about it in a seminar or something like that, again, a sort of closed environment. I think it's much more analogous to, say, the way Facebook works, where, people are comfortable posting on each other's walls, and they do so, at scale on the web. And, people are posting stuff on the web that they would never have done, just in the pre-Facebook days. And that's because there's a very comfortable environment where they can, they know who will look at the content, they know who can see the content. I think that our view is to model that environment online. Model the environment where you can decide who you're going to share this comment with. You can decide who sees it. The tricky thing is you want to make, you want to obviously generate engagement in the discussion platform. You don't want people just sharing all their comments with one other person, because then there's just going to be much less engagement generally around the paper. But you have to, the privacy thing I think is really, really difficult. I think, getting that right is absolutely critical. And we do have some thoughts about it, but, ultimately you never know until you try. So we're going to try.
So how are you guys doing? What are the numbers like?
So we're about 1.5 million users, adding about 3,500, 4,000 users a day.
A day?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's going really well. It's growing very fast. I think that fundamentally, as I said, our thesis is that scientific content is moving online. And I think one part of that is that an academic wants to have a really beautiful online presence, a presence that just like celebrates that research. So when you type in their name into Google and this page comes up first, it's like it's just a beautiful representation of their research. And it just celebrates it in its best possible light. And we provide that. I think the analytics are very addictive. For instance, historically, if you sort of, talk to as I said, some professor of physics, say at Stanford University, and say, you have 200 papers that you published in your life. Like how much usage, how much engagement with those papers happened over the last 30 days? Like how many page views, how many downloads, how many shares, how many recommendations, and so on. How much discussion? I honestly have no idea. It's just because that stuff is not tracked right now.
Yeah, it's sort of bringing the world of blogging to research, right?
Yeah.
We have that with blogs, right? That's what people.
Yeah, we have exactly. We have fairly detailed metrics around, generally around web content, and I think those metrics are coming to scientific content.
So, are there any? What are your thoughts about citizen researchers? Or, in science we have citizen science, right? So someone who's maybe not at a university, a professor or something, but they write a piece. They can have a profile, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. The site works on the basis that if you have an affiliation with a university, you can add that affiliation.
So you have to have an affiliation?
No, if you do, you can add that. But if you don't have an affiliation, then you can just be an independent researcher. And you can add the content, and the site's just fully accessible.
Okay, so let's talk about the real problem here. And you can get philosophical.
Okay.
You say you want to accelerate.
That's right, yeah.
Research.
Yeah.
So, but what problem are you solving there? Why does it need to be faster?
Okay, good question. I think.
And is there any loss if it does speed up, or I don't know. What's the underlying problem there?
I think that fundamentally, basically, all sort of innovation in the world, medical innovation, technological innovation, has its roots in a science paper. I think that honestly, the faster science moves, the faster all these other innovations will move. So, for instance, I think if we're looking for a cure for cancer, it's obviously going to come from the biomedical field. That is where it's in basic research that we're going to solve malaria, cancer, AIDS, and so on. It's in the basic research field that we're going to find alternative forms of energy. It's in the basic research field that when we do start sort of becoming a multiplanetary species and developing spacecraft that really can, achieve those sorts of distances. Again, that's going to come from the basic research world. So to see those benefits in technology and medicine, you've got to look to science. So I think, speeding up science is definitely a very important and huge priority. And I think that, as I said, there are some real breaks, as I see them, on scientific progress. And part of that is the 12-month time lag. I mean, I think, if it takes 12 months to share an idea and 12 months to see the responses on that idea, you can have iterations of the conversation that literally take years to play out. If every single iteration takes 12 months, a conversation.
But when it was taking years, was that did that have anything to do with the quality? Is what I'm wondering.
I think some.
It takes ideas so long to sort of gestate, right?
Yeah.
And come about. And you're a philosopher, and you're reading people who were here in back in the Greek times and Thomas Aquinas. I mean, you're reading some old people when you're in philosophy.
Yeah.
That these are really big ideas. They don't just happen every day.
No, that's
right?
totally true. That's totally true. I mean, I think there are some ideas where you read the paper and you have the ideas instantly. You can instantly see the mistake. I mean, happens all the time, actually. You're listening to a conference paper and you have a question instantly. It's not like it takes 12 months for the question to formulate in your mind. And I think there's a lot of content like that actually occurs to the person, the reader, instantly, and there is no opportunity for that to get shared. Some of the, obviously the huge insights take a long time to gestate. I generally think that the more connected a planet is, like a community is, the faster ideas will gestate. I mean, if you look at...
So this idea of a mind share.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at the last 100 years, and you look at the economic difference, I mean, the sort of difference in where the planet is economically today compared with 100 years ago, and the difference is vast. Whereas if you compare, if you look at the difference, between sort of, year 1112 versus 1212, that 100-year gap. Honestly, the standards of living probably weren't that different in that 100-year gap. There wasn't much acceleration. And I think one of the factors, honestly, that's driven this extraordinary acceleration in growth the last 100 years is the fact that all these technologies have been developed, like the telephone, the TV, the radio, and the internet, that make the world a lot more connected. So we can get feedback much more quickly on ideas and share ideas much more quickly. And I mean, even honestly, great geniuses like Einstein. I mean, the fact is, they were part of I mean, initially Einstein kind of worked as a patent clerk in the Swiss patent office and developed some of his, some early ideas there. And there's some quite cool lessons actually about him being outside of the academy and developing his ideas.
Right, he was at the Max Planck or something and then got kicked out or something.
He was actually very initially he was at the Swiss patent office. He was a patent clerk and developed like the special theory of relativity there. But it was just in the evenings and weekends. But later on, he became part of the academy. And, he was a social. He did discuss physics all the time with his colleagues, and he wasn't like a loner. So I think that if you just look at the last 100 years and try to explain the extraordinary growth that we've seen as a planet, I think it seems likely that part of that has to do with the sort of connectedness of the planet, the fact that we can just share ideas much more quickly and we can get them out there. And, just seeing the reaction to your own ideas helps you refine them. Seeing objections to your own ideas helps you refine them and so on.
So what is your next plan for the site? And what do you have to do to reach your ultimate goal with the site?
Yeah. I think about that all the time. I mean, we're trying to fundamentally change the way scientists communicate. As I said, we're trying to accelerate it in terms of bringing instant distribution to research and also kind of enrich the forms of interaction. So bring rich media into the discussion, data sets, code, videos, comments, blog posts, status updates, all these things.
What's the biggest challenge for rich media?
I think that all the technology exists, as we know. Like, it's very easy to share video online. It's actually very easy to share code online. I mean, there are lots of sites like GitHub, for instance, where it's very easy to share code. It's also pretty easy to share data sets. As we know, it's extraordinarily easy to share blog posts and tweets and status updates and comments. The question is, why is this not happening? It's definitely not a technology problem. It's an institutional behavioral problem. It's an incentive problem. The problem is that there's absolutely no incentive right now for a scientist to share a data set. It's relatively easy for them to do it. I mean, they have to spend a few days curating the data set so it can be actually used and is like, useful to a third party and understandable to a third party. It takes a few days to get to that stage. So they have to put some work in. But the reality is there's still no benefit. They can't put data, I published this data set online on their resume and expect to receive any credit from either their tenure committee or their grant committee. The same goes for a blog post. I mean, honestly, you could put the same quality ideas in a blog post as in a paper, but you wouldn't get any credit for putting the ideas in a blog post. And you often hear scientists saying, well, I've got this idea and I could blog about it, but the reality is that I wouldn't get any credit for that. So I'm just going to wait wait 12, 15 months and write up these ideas in the form of a paper. But the reality is the whole world loses out because of that 12 to 15 month time lag as they're sort of waiting to publish it in a paper as opposed to in a blog post. So it's an incentives problem. You can't put a blog post in a resume. I mean, it's just not even conceivable that a grant committee would look at, Richard Price published this blog post. They just wouldn't take that seriously, whereas Richard Price published this paper in a journal, okay, cool, that's fine. Even though it's the same words. And even though the blog post might have attracted more page views because it's open access, it's easier to share, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think the big challenge is what's known as sort of altmetrics, which is what we were talking about earlier. It's changing the way scientific impact is measured. So you can get credit for sharing a data set. And
this has to be done at institutional level, right? I mean, do you talk to any of these institutions?
I'm not sure that institutions are honestly how it's going to happen. I think that the way it's going to happen is that increasingly sites like Academia are evangelizing and empowering our users to share these sort of metrics. Where, our Academia is educating users about what a page view means and what sorts of metrics are actually possible when it comes to online content. Over time, I mean, this is something we're working on, but we'll allow people to upload their data sets. And we're already seeing that people are printing out their analytics pages, including with their tenure portfolios and their grant applications and so on. So as they start to kind of be able to upload data sets and video files and add comments on papers, they'll include those with their applications too. And what we're seeing as a result of this is that the committees, in other words, I think it's happening at a grassroots level, rather than doing big deals, very big sales deals effectively that have extremely long sales cycles and sort of deal cycles. What I think it's better to is allow the community, give them the tools that actually have some meaning for them and significance for them, like people do care about these stats. They will then take those stats to their tenure committee or grant committee. Those grant committees are starting to get sort of familiarized with the notion of page views and all these different metrics, and increasingly we'll start to expect them. I think a big lesson here is how does citation counts sort of emerge as part of the psychology and awareness of the academic community. I think it wasn't because of any big institutional deals, it was because academics were of view these citation counts reflect they celebrate the impact of my work, so of course I'm going to include them. And then increasingly that means these resource allocation committees, these jobs and grants and so on, start to expect citation counts. They see it and they say, well, gosh, I've started to get used to evaluating, looking at citation counts as one of the factors. So I think that's how this is going to happen. You build a great platform where people want to host their research, where they get some metrics for their research. They will take those metrics to these committees. The committees will start to get kind of educated about these metrics and start to expect these metrics. And so it's a virtuous cycle.
So in the beginning I asked you, is there any money in this open science stuff? I mean, in general, we've had quite a few open science people on. And because it's a new model, right?
Right.
Then that's the challenge. Who's going to pay for this?
Yeah.
So what is your business model?
By the way, I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, it's true we are open in the sense that, there are no paywalls or anything around the content, but I think, openness is not enough. Open science, that's become associated with this movement where the idea is bring the paywalls down around research content. And I think that's a really laudable initiative, and we're definitely part of that. But I think our views are much broader than, our mission is much broader than that. It's also about accelerating the speed of distribution and enriching the format of discussion.
Okay.
So kind of faster richer and open science is kind of what we believe in. And I mean, I can talk about how I see that making money.
Sure.
I think what it comes down to, I mean, if you take a company like Pfizer, so Pfizer spends around $7-8 billion a year on R&D. And every month, roughly speaking, about 60,000 biomedical papers get published. So those papers are being funneled into the sort of Pfizer R&D machine. And if imagine you're the head of Pfizer Research Capital, head of deploying, whatever it is, sort of $600 to $700 million every month on research. Thinking, I mean, fundamentally the way the sort of pyramid of research works is that you have the early stage high-risk research paid for by governments and done in the academic context. No private capital is that interested in this because it's so much high-risk stuff, and only governments are interested in that kind of thing. And then the R&D companies like Pfizer, Novartis, Merck, and so on are sort of monitoring what's going on at the academic layer and sort of taking out the promising ideas and then going and developing those, and sort of 1 in 10 of those will work. If you can, that's the relevance of like 60,000 biomedical papers going into Pfizer every month. And if you can right now, if you can develop a tool, for instance, that enables Pfizer to see which of those papers are taking off, and to see earlier than they have in the past, which academic research is trending, and what's really popular and what's looking promising. And if those results really do help them deploy their $700 million a month more effectively, then I think there's an enormous amount of money at that. So I see science as sort of very much, academic science, very much continuous with private sector R&D, and we all know that's a huge, like $1 trillion a year gets spent on R&D, of which about 200 billion is academic, 800 billion is private. So, and one feeds the other. The academic.
So you could offer them some kind of package that gave them some kind of metrics on those 60,000 papers that were coming out every month.
I mean, one broad philosophical point I should make here is that this is actually a relatively specific idea. I mean, I actually think that when you look at, when I try and predict how sort of scientific content is going to sort of evolve in the age of the web, and how the monetization is going to happen, the sort of lens I always use is like, well, the premise I always sort of work on is that scientific content is just a subset of web content. So when you look at like how peer review is going to work, well, how do we peer review web content? Like, how do we discover what to read? Well, we know that, and we use search engines, we use social networks, and so on. Similarly, when you ask the question, how are we going to monetize scientific content? I think that it's always good to ask the question, well, how does general web content get monetized? And the reality is that there's a whole mix of business models, and it's an evolving thing. I mean, if you look at Google, it's an advertising company. It makes money from advertising. If you look at Facebook, it largely makes money from advertising, but also a little bit through commerce, taking a cut of the platform transactions. If you look at LinkedIn, they make money through recruitment. Recruitment advertising and subscriptions and so on. So I think that I don't think there's any one way in which people are going to monetize open science. I think that
okay, so you're still working on your business model.
Yeah, but I'm very bullish. I think that the reality is huge amounts of money depend on science, and so if you can accelerate science and deliver up ways of seeing what's working and not working, and generally making the scientific process more efficient, which I believe the web in general does to industry, I think you'll figure out how to monetize that. I'm very bullish on the prospects of monetizing science, and I think that a huge amount of industry depends on science. And if you can make that industry if you can make the whole scientific process more efficient, then I think it's very clear that you're going to be able to make money from that.
So having a philosopher on, I have to ask some of my favorite questions.
Yeah.
And lately there's been this titanic clash between philosophy and science.
Yeah.
I mean, I read articles on it every week.
Right.
And Stephen Hawking famously came out last year at a Google conference and said philosophy is dead.
Right.
So, he said that philosophy hasn't kept up with science.
Yeah.
So what do you say about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. The question is, what is the role of philosophy? What has philosophy done in the last 2,000 years? And my sort of summed up view of the matter is that the role of philosophy is to spawn new disciplines. It's to create new disciplines. And there was a time, if you imagine.
So what's an example of that?
So I actually think that pretty much all the sciences both the natural sciences, the philosophy, chemistry, biology, and also the social sciences like economics, psychology, and linguistics, and so on, actually came out of philosophy. So I mean, the best examples of that are recent ones, like economics, psychology, and linguistics. Linguistics is probably the most recent one. It emerged out of the philosophy of language, largely, in the last sort of 100 years. And Noam Chomsky was kind of a huge early sort of father, I guess, of linguistics, and has a background in philosophy, philosophy of language. And before that, you had economics emerge out of philosophy. It just I think right now it's sort of amazing to imagine a world where we don't have people studying economics. We don't have I mean, of course, it's amazing to think of a world when there weren't people studying the flow of money and why people buy things and just the sort of fundamentals of economics. But those questions weren't clearly defined a long time ago. I mean, it was only the last 200 years where people like Adam Smith started to think very deeply about like what are the core questions here. Same goes for psychology. I mean, that emerged out of the philosophy of mind, and it took a while for the right questions to be posed and the clear distinctions to be made, which was the point at which it became a sort of discipline where you could make real scientific progress and actually do experimentation on some of these questions and actually take the questions forward. So I think the role of philosophy is to take an area which there's a lot of sort of conceptual cloudiness and confusion and just like no clear pathways, no clear distinctions. And you think about, okay, what are the key things, what are the key distinctions here, what are the key questions to be asking? So take a topic like free will. Free will is something we think about a lot. I mean, something that matters is part of our entire it's part of our sort of basis of existing. We assume that, a chair is not a free agent. It doesn't have any sense of, you can't blame the chair for doing anything because it's not a free agent, but humans are. And that's why we punish them and why we think notions of like what they deserve and what they don't deserve actually, sort of have some application. And I think that, there's a lot of conceptual work that has to be done sort of, well, what is free will? Actually defining what we really care about. If you were designing a world where you said, okay, agents in this world are going to be free, what does that world even look like? So I think that the role of philosophy is to provide some clarity on some really murky areas. I mean, to answer your question, again, like before you had the emergence of the social sciences, you had the natural sciences. And, if you wind back the clock to say 2,500 years ago when Aristotle and Plato and so on were alive, the reality is, there wasn't much of in fact, there wasn't any distinction between a scientist and a philosopher. I mean, if Aristotle was called a philosopher, but because there weren't clear distinctions between, say, what is a question of physics?
So what is the
distinction? Question of
between a scientist and a philosopher?
Well, I think that scientists typically work obviously sort of experimentally. So the question is what questions can you sort of go out and do an experiment and determine the results, whereas philosophers work from the armchair and sort of thinking in very sort of conceptual ways about what are some of the key questions. And I think there's one branch of philosophy where I think I think there are lots of branches of philosophy where in the past it has spun out these disciplines like physics, chemistry, and biology, and then later on economics, psychology, and linguistics, and so on, where it's brought a sort of conceptual clarity to a domain which scientists can then go and work with. I think there are some areas of philosophy where it's extremely implausible that they're ever going to become scientific disciplines. And those are things like ethics. When you ask a scientist, how do you create a nuclear bomb? They will tell you the answer. But if you ask, well, where should we use it? And what should be the sort of international policy around disarmament and so on, and usage of nuclear bombs.
So you don't envision a discipline of science for ethics at some point?
I
when you brought up the free will, I was thinking, Stephen Hawking might say, I'd rather study neuroscience.
Yeah.
And figure out biologically.
Yeah.
Whether we do, or how much free will we have.
Yeah.
And philosophers are seen as these people who just kind of sit and just kind of spin these really difficult thoughts, but what does it do for us?
I think one of the reasons that it can be difficult to see the role of philosophy is that this role I've articulated of it spawning new disciplines takes place literally over the course of tens and sometimes hundreds of years. So if you ask yourself a question like, what is the impact of biomedicine right now? It's kind of obvious. Well, people are working on malaria, and they'll probably cure malaria in like 10 years or 20 years, hopefully. It's pretty obvious what the goal is of a particular area of research. Whereas if you look at philosophy, you say, well, what discipline is philosophy spawning right now? Like, what discipline in 100 years will people say, oh, the birth of that happened in the early 2000s?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe the ethics thing. Or
people will have no idea, like right now, what philosophy is spawning right now. If you went back to the birth of economics, the birth of psychology, and you said, are you aware that an entire discipline is in the process of being spawned right now? They wouldn't know. So I think it does give rise to these questions like Stephen Hawking, like, what is it doing for us? But I think if you take a sort of 2,000-year view and you say, well, if you took out philosophy, and you took out any kind of form of conceptual clarification of like subject matter, would you? I think it's hard to imagine a world where there's just no thinking going on. There's no sort of abstract theorizing about here is a new domain, let's go and explore some of the core distinctions. It's very bizarre to the world.
Yeah,
imagine a world where that doesn't happen.
I read somewhere someone said that philosophy gives scientists the questions.
I think basically that's another way of phrasing exactly what I said, which is that, I wouldn't say all the questions, obviously the way I have to think about it is that philosophy sort of clears the
first questions.
Yeah, the initial set of questions and provides some key distinctions, which is now sort of clear enough to go and actually do some experiments. Like if you said, what experiments should we do to test free will? The reality is we don't actually know what free will is yet. We have no idea. We haven't done the core conceptual work. We haven't made enough progress on the core conceptual work to say, here is a key question which we go and can experimentally test. It's a very, very difficult topic. I think with ethics, let's take a question like, are moral, is there objectivity to sort of, moral opinions? Are things objectively good and objectively bad? Or is it just all a sort of matter of like subjective, like approval and disapproval and, I like this, I don't like that? Mm-hmm. Is murder objectively wrong, or is it just a case of like a lot of people don't like murder? It's pretty hard to imagine an experiment that will make progress on that question. I mean, that's why I said there are some areas of philosophy which I'm pretty honestly doubtful will turn into sciences, but I still think they're incredibly important. I mean, it'd be incredible to imagine a world where there was no sort of sensitivity to what ethics or how to treat other people.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of people have talked about those things for a long time, and we've gone, we've waffled back and forth. Sort of the human race.
Necessarily agree with that.
It didn't provide us any solid answers. I mean, it appears to me that more and more science is answering our questions as a race, and not just how to live longer, right? What we can take for malaria, you mentioned, but also where we came from.
I think there's certain areas where it's obviously science has been enormously successful and the sort of experimental method, but I wouldn't necessarily that means philosophy, isn't useful. I actually see philosophy as like having spawned those disciplines, and so I think that was the early role. I think that there are some areas where we have made a lot of progress, moral progress, for instance, and progress in civil rights. I mean, we should basically, on the whole, certainly in the West, treat people today far better than we used to. I mean, we used to, for instance, have slavery. We used to deny women the vote. We used to sort of do all these like extraordinary things that just violated people's human rights. Well, I think we're getting a lot more sensitive to these questions about how do you treat people, a lot more reflective. And I think part of that, honestly, is actually, and I think there's definitely been a lot of discussion. I mean, if you look at like the democratic revolutions in, say, the French Revolution, and then the American Revolution, which is we're celebrating the Declaration of Independence tomorrow. If you look at who provided the sort of, how did that happen? Well, I mean, I think it was a combination of people with a lot of energy, wanted to see change, but also the intellectual justification was coming from people like, some of the French sort of, democratic thinkers like Voltaire and so on. And I think that, these ideas about political philosophy and about ethics, they do seep into the public consciousness. If, for instance, if we ask ourselves, But
I wonder if it wouldn't be better if science was seeping more into the public consciousness.
Well, let me just make one more example. I think one important question for us to sort of think about as a species is it okay to eat animals? I mean, we slaughter literally, I think, billions of animals every year. I mean, there are about 24 billion chickens in the world, so I think, and about 1 billion cows, and we slaughter a lot of animals per year. Is it true that, it's possible that in 100 years' time, people look back on us and think, gosh, that was just unbelievably wrong. And I think we are starting to ask these questions about, is it okay to kill animals? We didn't ask those questions 1,000 years ago. Vegetarianism was just not on the agenda. Now it really is, and I think that, who's providing those arguments for and against vegetarianism? Well, the reality is, if you ask the average advertising executive, what they think about it, they don't have time to be sort of thinking about these issues in really careful detail and scrutinizing the arguments on a Friday evening or a weekend when they're just too tired after a long week at work. Honestly, it's the people like Peter Singer at Princeton, who's a philosopher, so it's really thinking hard about what are the arguments for and against, and gradually through teaching undergrads and also through obviously just writing articles in academic press and the newspapers, these ideas seep in. I am all for a more scientifically literate population too. I'm all for a more educated population, but I really don't think that where we should go as a society is to be like anti-humanities. I think it's very important for us as a human race to reflect on not just how do we do things, how do we get stuff done, which is the stuff that science focuses on, but what should we be doing? What should we be doing with our lives? How should we be treating each other? What actually matters? And what is good behavior and what is bad behavior? Those are the questions that I think humanities shed some light on.
I could talk about this for a long time.
Yeah, so could I.
We got to go. So thank you very much. Richard Price, founder of the online sharing site Academia.edu. Thanks.
Thanks for coming.
Today's show is made possible by SADPO, the world's largest cloud-based marketplace for research services. With SADPO, you can easily find the perfect research service provider and manage your project from anywhere in the world.
Okay, so I was going to ask you in the interview if scientists aren't the new kind of movers and shakers or rulers of the world.
Yeah.
Right? Because even though philosophers debated this, Plato thought philosophers should rule the republic, right?
Right.
But even though philosophers debated these questions about where we're from, who we are, all of a sudden this scientist, Darwin, comes along and said, here's where we came from.
Yeah.
And gave us real answers.
Yeah.
Right? And we've had scientists on the program like George Church and these guys, right? And they're really determining the future.
Yeah, yeah.
With the technology they're developing and stuff.
Well, so I basically think two things about kind of the role of humanities and philosophy in particular. I think one is it's really important that philosophy continues to spawn new disciplines. I definitely don't think we want to sort of say, okay, we've got enough disciplines right now. We can just sort of stop the philosophy program. And historically, it's produced and spawned these incredible disciplines, which, as you say, are delivering all these amazing answers. And I think that we should be hopeful that more disciplines will emerge in the future out of philosophy as it brings more of the world and more of the sort of messy cloudiness under more conceptual control. I think the second thing that we should be very cognizant of is these moral questions. Those are questions which are not answered by science, and the questions about how do we treat each other, what sorts of societies are good to live in, how should we structure, say, the politics, and how do we avoid war, how do we avoid a second Holocaust.
But at some point, science might be telling us that.
I think that it's quite. These are questions of sort of what is good.
Science gives us an answer that we can trust, that
So,
we can measure.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if we could leverage the extraordinary resources of experimental science to deliver answers to ethical questions. And if ethics can evolve to the point where it can deliver real questions, testable questions to science, that will be a huge success for philosophy, an enormous success. I think if it doesn't, which honestly I think is probably more likely in my opinion, I struggle to imagine ethical questions which, if you're trying to answer the question, what is the optimal tax rate? How much should the rich give to the poor? Mm-hmm. There's obviously how much the rich want to give to the poor, and how much the poor want to get from the rich. But what is the right amount? And what is it even to ask the question? Is there an objective question?
Okay, so you're still throwing your lot in with philosophy.
I think, it has a very critical role on the ethics side and the spawning disciplines role.